Hello and welcome to the Art of Being Human. I've been talking about suicidology and we've discussed quite a bit about it, but we've got a ways to go yet. And what my focus is today is on intervening. If you have a person or you know a person and you really believe that they might be suicidal, how do you intervene to help them? Remember, the focus is always to save a life and to help a person to be more comfortable. Now I'm going to review this chart once again just as a lead-in to intervention, and then after that we'll go directly into intervention. But just as a review, the cues and the clues that a person will leave if they're suicidal, how do you know what they are? Well, we've talked about direct cues. I'm going to kill myself, which is not what most people say. Most people aren't honest enough to come right out with it, although a few may. And then your indirect cues, you'd be better off without me. I feel like going on a vacation and never coming back. There's all kinds of little things that they say like that. Those would be indirect clues. Nonverbal clues, some things that they're doing that they're not talking about. Poor sleeping habits, a change in their eating habits, giving things away, making a will, and changes in their personal habits, which is unusual for them. Now, any one thing does not necessarily mean that a person is suicidal, but if you get a group of these things together, you may start to wonder about it. Changes in behavior, more accidents, which sometimes is a mask for suicide, an attempted suicide, but they don't want anyone to think of it as suicide because one thing, insurance won't cover. Insurance will never cover a suicide. And so therefore, if a person wants to die but they want their families to be financially taken care of, they'll create an accident or do something so it'll be considered to be an accidental death rather than a suicidal death. So you get more accidents as a mask for suicide. The suicide motions we've talked where a person does things like cut themselves or choke themselves or do something to see what it would be like to die. And this is like called a suicide move or a suicide motion. Withdrawal, isolation, and trouble in communication, trouble in conversation. All of these things can be changes in behavior. Then you have your environmental changes that sometimes can lead to a suicide, loss of a job, economic changes, poor health, failing courses in a school, or family conflicts. All of those things can contribute to a person wanting to commit suicide. And then we have the word solid: sad, old, lonely, ill, drunk. Any of those things can cause a person to be suicidal, but it's usually not one thing. Suicide just doesn't happen and a person says, oh, I think I'll commit suicide. I'm despondent, I'm in despair, let's commit suicide. Usually it's a rational decision that takes place over a period of time. And it sometimes takes anywhere from 3 months to 2 years to even plan a suicide. But there are impulsive suicides where a person decides to do it and does it, but those are more unusual than the planned rational decisions are. Well, let me take this down. And I want to, in terms of talking to people, let me get this just changed so I can see a little better. How do you intervene in a person, with a person, if you believe that they're suicidal? How do you go up and even ask them if they're suicidal or suggest that you're worried that they might be suicidal? How do you do that? How do you intervene? This is probably one of the most important things and important segments you'll ever see, because what I want to do is make a concise plan of action for you. So if you think that they're suicidal, if you ask them, by their answers, how would you tell whether they're telling the truth or not? And how would you tell how serious they are? And how would you know how much time you have to intervene? Those are all critical things, and I'm planning to cover all of those this segment. Well, what you have to do, first of all, is you have identified a person that you think might be suicidal. It might be a relative, it might be a friend. You may want to ask them if they're planning suicide. You may want to be confrontive. Being confrontive, however, does not mean being mean. There's a difference in confronting a person in love and just being assertive in confronting a person. You have to be gentle, you have to be caring, but you also have to let them know what you're thinking about. You never, if you're confronting them, demean them. You never let them think that their symptoms are silly, or you never do anything that would cause them to feel less than a valuable human being. You have to be very careful how you do this. You can't just say, oh, that's a stupid idea. What would ever make you think of that? Or you can't be that bad off. You're up and about. I mean, you can do it in such a way that feels so demeaning that it's not helpful at all. But asking a person about it will not cause them to want to do it. As a matter of fact, for most people, it'll give them a great sense of relief that somebody knows about it. Because truthfully, very few people know for sure that that's what they want to do. They're thinking about it, they're planning it, they think that's what they want to do, but they're open to the possibility of changing their mind. The only cases that I have run into or learned about are people who who for medical issues think that they should commit suicide because they don't want to burden their families. And so what they do is they plan it carefully. In fact, there was on television, there was a program where a person was saying, a wife, I am ill, I'm going to not get well. This is an illness that would be terminal. I don't want to burden my family with this, and I want to decide when I want to die. And I will know the time that it's appropriate for me to die, and I need to have help in doing that. And she had it all planned out, and her husband was willing. He was sad about it. He didn't want to do it, but this was her wish, and this was her desire, so he went along with it, and they planned the suicide together, and then they lived their lives. And when the time came when she felt she was being so debilitated that she could no longer have a good quality of life, she told him, this is the time that I'm going to do it. This is the time I need to do it. So they gathered the family around, and she did it, and she died. And I guess it was legal. She had the medication, she knew what to take, she knew what to do, and they just sat by her side until she eventually just died. She just passed on, and it was her decision. Now, in this particular case, that's not mental illness. That's a clear, rational decision for a person to get rid of themselves because of circumstances that are beyond their control. Now, I do not approve of this, and I do not suggest that a person ever do this, because I don't think it's up to us to decide when we die. It wasn't up to us to decide when we were born. I don't think it's up to us to decide when we die. Nonetheless, people are doing it, and they're even getting medication to do it from their doctors. The doctors aren't there when they do it, but their family members may be. But at any rate, this goes to show that not all suicides are due to mental illness. But if you're going to talk to a person, you will ask them, is there something that you're not telling me? Are you thinking about hurting yourself in some way? Are you considering doing something in which we wouldn't see you anymore? I mean, they'll get the message, but you're not being so confrontive as that you're beating them over the head with it. You're just giving them a chance to open up and talk about it. Now, they're going to either say yes or no, and you have to evaluate on the basis of what they say how serious they are, because it will give you a clue and a cue yourself as to how much time you have to intervene should you decide to intervene. And by law, you must intervene. If I know that a person is going to kill themselves or attempt to kill themselves, it's up to me to intervene. There are things I have to do. I have to contact the family or the person's pastor if they have one, or the police department, or neighbors, or their relatives, whatever. I have to step in and do what I can, and if I don't, and the person kills themselves, then the law just may decide that I'm partly liable for their death because I didn't do anything to stop it. You know, it's a very strange thing, the liability laws. I remember having surgery. It was knee surgery, and I asked the nurse, can I drive? And she says, no, don't you dare to drive. And she told me how long it would be before I could drive. And I said, just out of curiosity, what would happen if I drove? And I reassured her I wasn't going to do it because I wasn't going to do anything against the doctor's wishes. But I was curious as to what would happen. And she says, well, he would be sued. And I says, why would he be sued? If he tells me not to drive and I drive and it's my decision to drive and he's not there to stop me, then how does that make it his fault? I don't think it's his fault. She said, but the law would say that he didn't make it clear enough to you that you couldn't drive, and so therefore it would be his fault that you did it and he could be sued for malpractice. Now, I think that's pretty stupid, to tell you the truth. I went to my doctor the other day, and he had told me to take 2 pills at a time of a certain medication, and I didn't realize that. I thought he said 1. So when I went back to the doctor, and he said, of course, you're taking 2 pills. I says, no, I was taking 1. I says, I thought I was supposed to take 1. He says, that's my fault then. I says, well, you may have told me 2, and maybe I just didn't hear you right, or maybe I just normally take 1 pill, so that's what I was going to do, and I didn't stop to think it was an increased dose. He says, it would be my fault because I did not make it clear enough to you that you're supposed to take 2 and not 1, so that's my fault. Well, it isn't his fault, from my perspective, if he told me to take 2 and I didn't understand it or I forgot it and on my own I did something else. It wasn't deliberate on my part to be disobedient, but it wasn't. But he was clear about what he wanted me to do and I didn't catch it. I don't consider that to be his fault, but he considered it to be his fault. So the rules of liability are so delicate and they're so profound. If you know of a person that's going to kill themselves, you must step in. You must step in. So you would answer, you talk to them and say, do you think that something's going to happen? Do you think that you're going to hurt yourself in some way? Is there something that I can do to help prevent that? And so you approach it that way. Now they're going to say yes or they're going to say no. We're going to handle it here first in terms of what if they say yes? Yes, I think I might do something. What do you do? Well, you might ask them, do you have a plan? Do you have a plan? Do you know how you're going to do it? Do you know where you're going to do it? Do you know when you're going to do it? You ask them questions. Now, you don't just bombard them with it. Well, I'm sorry that you feel this way, but do you have a plan? And of course, the answer is going to be yes or no. Why do you want to know? Well, I want to know if they have a plan because I want to know how serious they are. And I want to know if they have the means available and if the plan is very specific, because that's going to be important for me to know that if I'm going to try to intervene and stop it. So I listen carefully to what they have to say. I want to know how specific that plan is. Well, yes, I've decided I'm going to do it, you know, and this is the way I'm going to do it. Now, a lot of people wouldn't be that honest, and they would say, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm thinking about it. If they're telling the truth, and remember, you never can say never, but if they're telling the truth, you've got more time to work with them if they don't know. And it is in your best interest as a person who wants to mediate and help them if they don't know. Because if they say, yes, I'm going to do it, I have all the pills, and they're all sewn into my pillow, so that the time I do it, I can just undo the pillow and take all of the pills at one time. That's a very, very specific plan, and they might have the means available. If they say, yes, I want to do it, I'm going to jump off a bridge and drown myself, but there's no water around. Or if they're excellent swimmers, you know, you have to doubt maybe how serious they are. I'm not saying they're not serious, but if they could change their mind, they would be able to save themselves if they change their mind. So if a person says, I'm going to swim out in the middle of the lake and drown, but you know that they're practically an Olympic-style swimmer, they're very strong at swimming, they can well change their mind and then just simply swim back. But if they're going to jump out of a boat or something in the middle of the lake and they don't know how to swim, and they've never learned how to swim, and they're just going to flounder there, they can drown. So you have to evaluate. Not only do they say they're going to do it, but do they have the means available to do it? And is it something that they could do and get themselves caught in a situation where they could not change their mind? If they could not change their mind, say they're going to jump off a bridge and they're halfway down, they can't go back again, then you know it's serious. If it's something that they don't have the means available the way that they're describing it, then there's more of a chance that maybe they're going to change their mind. So you have to evaluate all of that. How specific is that their plan? Do they have the means available? Have they experienced a loss? Now that becomes important, because if you've experienced a loss, I don't mean necessarily a suicidal loss, although it may be, any kind of a loss. A person is more prone to do it if they have experienced a loss, because death is on their mind. Whether it's a suicidal loss or whether it's a loss due to a natural death, it doesn't matter. A loss is a loss, and people are more prone to do it if they have experienced a recent loss, because they're in grief anyway. Death is on their mind anyway, and so that makes them, it tends to make them more amenable to it. How recent is the loss? Now that's important too. Did they lose their best friend 2 weeks ago? Did they have a very recent loss? Or did they have a loss and it was like over 3 years ago, where you would expect that a lot of the grief process would have been over? I do need to tell you, however, that grief takes a long time. Some people suffer from it for a long time, and you can't say, well, it's been a few months now, they must be over their grief. Some people grieve for years, especially if it's a complicated grief. They can grieve for years. They can be caught up in a complicated grief that lasts sometimes for almost the rest of their lives if they don't get treated for it. So you have to know about the means, about whether they've had a loss, how recent is the loss. Was the loss a suicidal loss? I think they're more prone if it is a suicidal loss. However, any kind of a loss would make a person more prone. Have they attempted suicide before? That's a very important consideration. If they have considered suicide before, then they're more prone to think about it again. You know, it's not unusual for a person who's depressed to think about suicide, even if they have no plans to do it. If they're in a lot of pain, if they're having a serious illness that they're not recovering from, if they don't see any hope of getting better, if their financial state is such they see no point in recovery, they don't see that they're going to be able to recover losses that they have endured, and they're down and out and they feel all of that, then it's not unusual that a person would think about suicide. If you have a huge back injury, you're in tremendous pain, you can barely move, you can't bend over and reach your toes, you can't even dress yourself, it's not unusual for a person to think about suicide. The thing is, though, that doesn't mean a person's going to commit suicide. They may think about it. They may have fleeting moments of, oh, if only I could commit suicide and all of this would be over with. That's not unusual in a depressed person. However, that doesn't mean that they are suicidal. It's just a fleeting thought here and there. I think most people have fleeting thoughts here and there. That doesn't mean that they're suicidal. But if they're thinking about it a lot, to the point where they're thinking about making plans to do it, wondering what would be a good time and how do they protect their families, and it becomes a very serious matter with them, then you have to consider that this person could be suicidal. A lot of doctors will hospitalize a person that they feel is suicidal. And they've got every right to do it. And the reason they do it is to keep the person safe. If you were to go to the doctor and say, I have been feeling suicidal lately, and my situation is bad, and I'm feeling bad, and I'm not getting better, the doctor may well hospitalize a person and put them on a suicide watch until they can be treated to feel better emotionally, and then they can be released from the hospital. It is basically to keep the person safe from himself. And so you have to consider that if you go to a doctor and they ask you if you're suicidal and you say yes, then they consider that to be an important piece of information that needs to be treated, just like anything else you may be suffering from needs to be treated. Now, if we talk about suicide, and if you are confronted with a person, it doesn't mean you're going to cause them to do it. It may give them relief, as I said before, because somebody finally knows. It may not prevent them from committing suicide, but what it will do is it will cause them to think more about it, plan longer. It may give you more time. If they admit that they're suicidal and you work with them on it, you may not have success in preventing them from killing themselves, but you may have a lot more time to work with them so that the chances of their killing themselves is much less. I know you would obviously, if you had a friend that was suicidal, you would take them to a doctor. You would make sure they went to a doctor to get professional help. This is something that you really can't do on your own. However, you can work with the doctors, you can work with a person, you can spare their lives and work with them, because a person, if they're prevented from doing suicide the way that they wanted to, they're not going to just rush out and do it the next day. If I prevent a person from killing themselves, and I have on one day, it doesn't mean they're going to turn around and do it the next. What they're going to do is rethink the whole process all over again, replan all over again. And if the preferred means of killing themselves is not available, then they're not going to rush out and do something else instead. So if they want to do it by taking pills and then the pills disappear, they're not going to decide to go over and the next day and jump off a bridge. They're going to wait until their preferred means is available. Now remember, this is a general rule of thumb. It's not, you never can say never. You never can be 100% accurate, but you can do the best that you can, and you can spare a lot of lives that way. We're about out of time, so I'm going to close it here. We're going to continue with intervention the next segment, so please join me then.